Morning, everybody, and welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable, our last one of November in 2024. Lovely to have you all with us. Lovely to have so many people who've been able to jump on so early for today's session as well. So thank you very much for joining us today. To those who don't know, my name is Matt Baird. I've been running this now for nearly 4 years. The idea originally was just to bring people together to discuss some of the key themes that were going on in the social housing space. And 150 something sessions later, here we are with over 2,000 people on the mailing list, having had over 1,000 people join us this year, discussing anything and everything that we can possibly think of. But this is a session that's always saved in the calendar. I'm really, really grateful to the CIH for sponsoring this session this year on 16 Days of Activism, and to Alertical, who sponsored the 2024 series of the Social Housing Roundtable. But this is a session, as I say, that we do. We first ran last year with a different provider who came on to kind of talk about some of the key themes that were coming up. And this year, as I say, delighted that the Chartered Institute of Housing have partners with us. We've got 3 speakers with you today, so we're going to be kicking things off very shortly with Alison Inman, ex-president of the CIH. We've then got Dr. Kelly Henderson, who's with us, who, if you don't know, if what she doesn't know about domestic violence, there isn't worth knowing. I think in terms of the insight and guidance she's provided to the sector for a number of years now. And then Stephanie Morphew is with us from the CIH perspective, who's going to provide some of the insight around policy practice and some of the things that are going on at the moment. We're also very honoured to have Jim Strang with us, who Jim is going to provide some kind of context in the Q&A and talk a little about some of the learnings from his presidency as well, and we'll be here to answer some questions as we go through. Just going to mute that. To those who don't know, so day to day, I work in recruitment. I've recruited in the social housing space for 13 years, and this is what makes this and keeps this going for free. So if anyone is ever looking for recruitment support, please do reach out. It keeps this amazing forum growing and growing. But without further ado, I'm going to pass across to Alison to kick off today's session, and really, I guess, to share some of the insight from her time as president, from the work that she's conducted since, but also, I think, just to really shed some light on 16 Days of Activism and why it's so important. So, Alison, without further ado, over to you.
Okay, hello everyone. It's delightful to see some familiar faces on the call, and actually I'm sitting here feeling really not intimidated, but there are some real experts on from the domestic abuse world on this call, and I'm looking at Viv Bicker, I'm looking at Nikki Clark, and Alex Gibbs, lots and lots of people who know a lot more than I do and have worked in this field much more deeply than I have. And I just wanted to make us, to start by saying we're only having this discussion because of the work and the activism of ordinary women. It's really difficult to sort of get your head around the fact that the first women's refuge opened less than 50 years ago. It feels like yesterday to people of my age, and it probably feels like ancient history to people like Neil Goodrich. Kind of. But it's very, very, very recently that we have started this movement to eradicate, first of all, to protect women, and then to move towards eradicating violence against women and girls. And I'm going to start with a non-apology, in that the work I did, I very much centre women at the heart of what I do, and I think whilst there is undoubtedly domestic abuse can affect absolutely everybody, I took the decision that the number of women and girls that are dying as a result of abuse means we really, really need to sort of centre them in our discussions. So it's really interesting to have this discussion, because I've not this used to roll off my tongue when I was CIH president and just after. But I was thinking back to actually, why did you become CIH president? It's an immense honour, and you're the representative of housing professionals within the professional body and the wider sector. But there's also this sort of slightly odd thing where you get to have a focus to your presidency. And people have done lots of different things. So Julie Fadden did some amazing work around street homelessness. Geraldine, how they did a lot of work around young people and so on and so forth. And just before I became president, I was interviewed. I'm so old. I was interviewed as part of an oral history project. And it was about the beginnings of the women's refuge movement in East Anglia and East London, which is where I've been involved with 2 refuges. And it really made me think back to I became involved in Basildon Women's Aid in 1986, and it was a really weird time, and we thought the world was going to end because of nuclear weapons, and we had Greenham and all that kind of stuff kicking off. I wasn't sure if we'd still be here in 40 years' time, but if we were to be here in 40 years' time, I genuinely believed that we would have eradicated domestic violence. How naive was that? But we're at the beginning of a movement. We're beginning to see women feel able to, to report and to see refugees and it felt a time of real sort of progress, and undoubtedly it was. But as a result of thinking back to those days, and then I think it was about 2017, 18, thinking, well, actually, what's changed? And during that time, I've been a magistrate for 15 years. I sat on the family panel as a voice, and I was a voice for people who understood domestic abuse, and which there were not many. And it didn't seem to be getting worse. And in fact, the number of the predominance of abuse amongst younger people is heartbreaking. The different ways that we now recognise that abuse is perpetrated. So it used to be literally you had to turn up at the police station with a black eye for the authorities to take you seriously. At Colchester Women's Aid in the late 70s, we had social workers accusing the staff of breaking up families. They were very, very, very different times. There's a tale from Southend of an MP ringing up his local women's refuge and saying, I've got a gentleman here in my surgery and he wants his wife back, and I insist that you deliver her to me. So it's, times have changed, but the level of violence abuse has not. The number of women dying as a result of abuse is more or less static over the last, since we've been gathering those statistics. So it felt like here is a time where does, home, we believe as housing professionals, a decent home is the bedrock of absolutely everything. It helps with education, health, social care, living your best life. Everything starts and finishes in the home. So why is it on our watch, home is the least safe place for so many people, and particularly so many women and girls? So that was the sort of genesis of, well, actually, for a year, can I start some conversations within the sector with these incredible experts, of which I am not one, but just focus a bit of time. And it was the same time that Daha was starting, and I'm sure Kelly will talk a little bit about Daha. We're beginning to see the beginnings of some kind of accreditation, and Daha, the wonderful thing has been that, watching Daha over the last, I think it's 10 years since Daha started. I remember Keith, the late Carl, goodness me, it's a senior moment, Kelly, Carl Sargent in Wales, kicking off the event to launch Daha in central London 10 years ago. And I learned a lot from him, because what he said, he was really, really clear. So Carl Sargent was a housing minister in Wales, and he began to put conditions upon funding, and it's a really good way to change behaviour. So he insisted on gender balances on boards, and it happened. He said, well, actually, if you want to work with us at Welsh Government, then you need to have a policy on domestic abuse. And suddenly everyone had a policy on domestic abuse. So actually linking those two things was really, really important. And at the heart of the sort of Make a Stand, which is what came out during that year, were some pretty basic requirements around having a domestic abuse policy that's really visible, having a named senior person within your organisation who's responsible for work around domestic abuse, making sure that your HR policies and your people offer, it takes on board the fact that we employ a lot of people who are experiencing domestic abuse, and the bit we never talk about, which is that we are employing a lot of people who perpetrate domestic abuse, and that's the bit where there is an awful lot of work to do. And then actually making things clear, making information clear to our residents, because the domestic abuse field is quite complex. If you're an outsider, knowing the difference between a refuge and an IDFA and a MARAC and a this and a that, it's got a real complex infrastructure around it. So we wanted to try and do some work to clarify some of that. And then off we went. So I'm going to stop there because I've already talked for 3 times as long as I should, I think. So sorry.
Oh, please don't apologise. It was really, really interesting, and certainly appreciate the insight and everything you provided there, Alison. But I am going to go to Kelly, who's going to, as you say, talk about some of her experience, and I guess 16 Days of Activism and some of the story behind that as well. So Kelly, over to you.
Yeah, great. Can everyone hear me okay? Excellent. Good. So as Alison said, we started DAHA about 10 years ago now. And I think obviously now we've got Nikki here from Standing Together, so doing some great work. So massive shout out to Nikki there, who is just brilliant. So we started, as I say, 10 years ago, and I remember at the time, just kind of carrying on from kind of Alison setting the scene, really. I remember at the time, kind of asking people, I was starting my PhD research around the same time as well, which was on the role of housing in a coordinated community response to domestic abuse. And I always say that's such a snappy title, isn't it? And I remember at the time kind of writing out to housing providers from across the UK and asking them to send me their domestic abuse policies. And what I got back was quite a lot of antisocial behaviour policies, which then had and domestic abuse, or it would talk about antisocial behaviour and domestic abuse. And there was kind of no kind of real focus on domestic abuse in its own right. And a lot of our responses were kind of based on our response to antisocial behaviour. And so we didn't have that expertise in the housing world that we needed to be tackling something that's going on in our homes, as Alison said. And I think if you just look at the UN figures from today, which I think, yesterday, they said that 85,000 women and girls were killed intentionally by men, last year. And 60% of those deaths were committed by somebody close to the victim. And the UN also said that kind of figures show that globally, the most dangerous place for a woman is for her home, where the majority of women die at the hands of men. So kind of in the housing world, what are we doing about that? And for me, somebody who chose to work in housing back in 1997, kind of for me, housing is all about kind of social justice. So they didn't really kind of fit together, that we weren't doing anything about that. So I think that for me was something that I wanted to do more about, and started a campaign for kind of regulation around domestic abuse, because as you all know, if you work in housing, we've always had to do something around antisocial behaviour. So our responses to antisocial behaviour is quite good. Obviously, there's always room for improvements, and I am by no means in any way, shape or form an expert or even a novice in antisocial behaviour, I might add. So I'm sure there's be people on the call who know a lot more about that. So I think that the kind of that having that real focus and expertise, as Alison has already mentioned, was something that we really needed to do. And I would say that over the 10 years, there has been that change, and there has been that focus, and there's been some great organisations doing some great things. And so for me, that feels like kind of it feels like hopeful, I suppose. And I suppose, like Alison, I started working in domestic abuse in the early 90s, and you think, well, by the time, I'm 50, this kind of won't be a thing. So I still have some hope that obviously we're going in the right direction. And I think some of the things that I've kind of encountered over the years of working in domestic abuse and housing has kind of given me that hope. And I just wanted to point out a couple of things. Obviously, we have the Social Housing Regulation Act, and then that said that we must, housing providers are going to be regulated around domestic abuse. So we've got to have a policy. But I mean, I suppose as well, it's thinking about, well, if you've got to have a domestic abuse policy, well, what does that actually mean? And I think we always talk about not having a policy that just, you know, sits on a shelf. But how does your domestic abuse policy interface with all other policies? You know, your rent arrears policies, your income maximisation policies, kind of repairs. How does that all fit together? And I think that's what one of the things that I'm seeing some good work around, and some others that where there's still a lot of work to do. But I think that determination that it's no good just to have a domestic abuse policy, but it's that kind of you know, that link with everything else that we do in the housing world as well. And obviously we've also, in terms of regulation, we've also got to cooperate with local authorities to meet their duty regarding having a domestic abuse strategy and commissioning accommodation services for domestic abuse victim survivors and their children. So I think what I hear a lot of people saying, actually, no, I'm not part of that as a housing organisation. So I think we've got a real push to get out there and meet the specialist organisations and see what we can add to the picture. So I think there's a lot more work to be done there. I think there's some great work going on in Scotland on the Scottish borders that I've been working with. So many of you will know Michelle Meldrum, who's also on the advisory board of Addressing Domestic Abuse. Addressing Domestic Abuse has been going for 3 years now, and a lot of the work that we do is supporting organisations around their response to domestic abuse. We carry out research and evaluation, and we carry out a lot of training as well, all across the country. So we were kind of working with the Scottish Borders Network, and that was 4 organisations that came together, so quite small organisations, and they wanted to kind of work together, because what they found quite often was they might have staff moving between organisations quite a lot, and also you might have tenants moving between organisations. So you might have somebody giving a great response in one Scottish Borders organisation, then moving somewhere else, and that response is different. So led by Michelle and Dan Blake, and as I say, 4 organisations coming together and really looking at what they could do together. And I suppose, you know, when you are working with other people, then that kind of encourages you to kind of keep improving. So I think there's a lot of scope for us in the housing world to kind of come together, and I'm sure that Nikki in a Q&A might talk about some of these things and some of the great work that she does in this area. Nikki Clark, because there's like about 70 Nikkis on the call, so no pressure there, Nikki. So I think there's that real scope for us to kind of work together, and I think you know, make that difference together. And I think Alison talked about, you know, the information that we put on our website, and for me, I think that's going to be really crucial. I think what we put on our website really sets out our intention, and it sets out the response that victim survivors can get if they do come forward. And we know that it takes a lot of courage to come forward. So if your website isn't kind of very welcoming and understanding around domestic abuse, then as a victim survivor, you're not going to feel that that's something that you're going to get a good response. So in training, sometimes we do this exercise where we'll say, you know, if you were to click onto your website and you've got 5 minutes, if say you're a victim survivor and the perpetrator's gone out of the house, they've left a phone in the house, which they don't normally do, and you're going to seek some help, kind of how would you seek that help? And so if you think, well, actually, I wouldn't dare, you know, click on a domestic abuse charity specialist organisation, you might feel that, oh, actually, I might click on the housing provider. So if you were to click on that housing provider, just think about in your own organisation. So maybe after this call, have a think, have a go, and see how many clicks it would take for somebody, one of your tenants, to get any information about domestic abuse. As Alison said, that was one of the make a stand pledges, was to kind of have that information on your website. And so when I kind of go to do training somewhere, I'll always have a look at that organisation's website, and sometimes I'm really surprised that, you know, there's nothing on there straight away. And I think that's something that we've got a lot more work to do, kind of in that space as well. So I don't know how much more time I've got left, Matt, if I'm going over. So just before I get off my soapbox.
No, there is no soapbox. And I think when we're talking about something like, you know, we're talking about the 16 Days of Activism, now is the time to really be going, actually, now's the time for action. So please continue if there's another point you'd love to make.
Oh, good, excellent. Yeah, so I just think that there's so much that we can do, and I think by working together, looking at the information that we put out to our tenants. So as I've already talked about websites, but what about our newsletters? And I always talk about the case of Mary, who we did a visit when I worked in housing in the Northeast. We did a visit and we left a tenant's handbook for Mary, and in that handbook it had a description of what domestic abuse was. So it wasn't a case of, well, domestic abuse is blah blah blah, and the government definition. It was just a definition to say this is what domestic abuse is, and this might be an example of what it is. So Mary was 79 at the time, and we left the tenant's handbook, and then the next morning, and in Mary's case, the rent was always paid. The garden was always spotless, like Kew Gardens, I always say when I'm talking about it. And, everything was great. So on paper, everything looked great. But the next morning, Mary came down to our office at 8:30 and said, you know what, I think I might have been living with domestic abuse for over 40 years. And that story of Mary will never leave me, because I think, that one chance that she had was when we left the tenant's handbook, and we missed it so many times before. And, she might have looked on our website, maybe there was nothing there, but getting that tenant's handbook and a description of what domestic abuse might look like, instead of, just a government definition and some examples of what that was, meant that Mary came down to our office at 8:30 and disclosed what had been going on in her life. Then we were able to support Mary. So I think every interaction we have with the customer, we've got that chance to make a difference. We've got that chance where, somebody might feel that today's the day I can reach out, and today's the day I'm going to get that response. So I think we should never underestimate in housing the difference that we can make. So I will now finish before I rant on any further. But as I say, it's just always good then, when you've worked in housing and domestic abuse over the years, that listen, just to reflect what Alison was talking about, some great people that we've worked with over the years, and obviously Alison and Jim, who carried on the issue of domestic abuse, and everybody that I speak to who has been kind of heard Jim's story, it's really impacted on them. So I think, the role of men in tackling domestic abuse and being part of the answer is really crucial. So massive thank you to Jim for, telling his story and making that difference to so many housing professionals. So thank you.
No,
thank
you, Kelly. Please don't at all. I'm going to go very briefly to Stephanie, and then there's a point in the chat, and then I want to bring in Jim as well. But Stephanie, do please come in. Just if you can follow that, please try.
Exactly. I think, as Alison said, there are some giants in social housing and domestic abuse in the room, and I'm definitely not one of them. And I have been personally supported by quite a few of the women on this call. So thank you very much for coming along. Make a Stand, as Alison Inman's and Jim Strang's presidential campaign, has become a flagship within CIH. We really hark back to its importance and its impact all the time, and it's shown by our compulsion to revisit it again and again as a campaign. It's not a campaign that's has gone away after a year of thinking about it. It just keeps on influencing our policy work. Our homes, our people, our problem is the tagline. I think we will need to keep that in mind when we think about how domestic abuse is addressed within housing providers. And the 16 days says on the UN website that it's an opportunity to revitalize commitments that you already have to addressing domestic abuse. So we're using it as this opportunity. And to that end, in 2023, CIH Scotland and Scottish Women's Aid published a report which assessed the domestic abuse policies of Scottish organisations that signed the pledge, wanting to check if social landlords had followed up on their commitments and to what extent. Anecdotally, they were aware of landlords who hadn't developed DA policies at all, and others that were seeking to develop ones in a haphazard manner.
Definitely. I don't know if you can move a little bit closer to your mic. I think a couple of people are just missing what you're saying. That was all.
Hello, can you hear me? I'm in a situation where my microphone is here, my camera is here. So
that's great. Thank you.
This research is the best practice guidance that they had developed in 2019, the Scottish Women's Aid, as a framework to assess the compliance of these domestic abuse policies. Key findings were, of the 73 Scottish landlords who signed the pledge, CIH were only able to access 41 of these, so only above half. And then of those, less than a quarter, 9 met the requirements of the good practice guidance. And the examples of things that Kelly spoke about above, which was conflating with ASB, of poor policies, having lengthy explanations of what domestic abuse may be, but not actually going into the details of the protocols and actions they would take if they found it in their homes. How would they identify it? The response from housing providers was muted. However, the findings were used successfully to make the case for the Scottish Government for the need of a mandatory DA policy for Scottish social landlords. This is now included in the draft of the current housing bill being considered by Scottish Parliament, and it's a reminder that the work that we're all doing, chipping away, can make a difference. In England, we're looking to replicate that work, and in a leap from 73, there are 463 housing providers in England that signed and make a stand. 2 weeks ago, we reached out to all of them, asking them to recommit to the pledge and asked them for them to send their domestic abuse policies and their allocations policies. And in the lead up to this session, we've been working with academics from King's College London and Oxford Brookes University on new data related to local authorities in England who signed the pledge. Last year, Catherine Brickell, who I think is on the call, and Mel Nowicki, in collaboration with the Shared Health Foundation, released the Debt Tract, exploring how debt, often in combination with domestic abuse, are one of the most common forms of homelessness. And they followed up that research by analysing the allocations policies of 294 local authorities, where they found that homeless households, those in the most housing need, were sometimes unable to move on from temporary accommodation due to the punitive policies related to debt that they had. In response to these findings, we conducted an analysis of the local authorities who signed the Make a Stand pledge, represented in the full data set. The aim was to discover if signees were markedly ahead in their policies and practices for domestic abuse survivors than the national picture. And the key findings we found was almost all, 96% of the Make a Stand signees who are local authorities, mentioned domestic abuse in their allocations policy, but this was only slightly above the rate of the original research at 94%. Additionally, 17%, less than a fifth, of those signees explicitly made an exemption for housing related debt in cases of domestic abuse. And this was the same proportion of the original research. And what this means, or at least our analysis of this, is that those who made the commitment publicly to put their head above the parapet against domestic abuse are not performing better than the national picture at the moment. Worryingly, one of the Make a Stand signees was found to group debtors who may well be survivors of domestic abuse with perpetrators of domestic abuse and those who commit antisocial behaviour under unacceptable behaviour that would exclude them from accessing a social home. And these are the changes that we need to be highlighting through research and putting forward as evidence to change policies and practices across the sector. To make sure that we're not stigmatizing and re-traumatizing households through our practices and letting them be able to move out of homelessness. And I'll pass back to you, Matt. Apologies for any sound problems.
That's all right. Don't worry too much. I know with the recording and stuff, I think some people can hear fine, some might not. So hopefully via the recording, if you did miss any of that, obviously it'll be available on the YouTube and Spotify channels after. But equally, I can share the stats around that Stephanie's just shared with the group there. I do want to go to Jim just to provide a couple of bits of insight as well. I think it's really interesting that each year, and to those who don't know about Unite, 16 Days of Activism, obviously every year they have a slightly different kind of hashtag or whatever it will be that will come through. And this year's was No Excuse. And it's interesting, I feel that when I saw it was No Excuse this year, I mean, Jim, obviously, look, I'd love to hear your insight, thoughts, etc. But the fact that that's having to be put as the tagline this year, I think says an awful lot in and of itself as well. But I'd love to pass over to you just for some thoughts on, obviously, the work that's gone on before, but also, everyone here has really advocated for the amazing work that you did whilst being president. So I just want to pass over to you for just some final thoughts before we go to a more open forum group discussion.
Oh, listen, thanks very much, Matt, for the introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Excellent. Well, listen, the reason I joined up with Alison on this was, and I've got to pay tribute to Alison Inman because she had a big track record on this, and I can remember specifically listening to Alison speak about why she was supporting Women's Aid in particular. And I've got to say, at that time I was 60, just over 60, and when I was growing up as a youngster, I suffered domestic abuse, and it was quite a therapeutic exercise for me in that Alison made me stand up and be counted, because it dawned in me that I'm a man, I'm senior in housing, I can do a damn sight more than I have been doing over the years, and it really struck a chord with me, and I was delighted to follow on Alison Inman's year as president, and we had 2 years on Make a Stand campaign. I'm particularly proud of the legislation that's taking place now up and down the country, particularly in Scotland, but we cannot stand back and take it for granted. As Alison said, when 40 years ago, when she first started talking about these things, she thought it would be over and done with and we'd have addressed it, but we haven't. We've made progress. Kelly pointed out we are making progress, but we have to maintain that momentum. So every housing organisation has to sign up to Make a Stand campaign. Every housing organisation has to walk the talk. And my experience speaking throughout the country in my period as president is the number of people, number of men who shared a early life as I did. There's a lot of us out there. We really need to stand up and be part of this. We cannot allow it to continue any longer. So that's all I would like to say. I'm incredibly proud of Alison Inman and Kelly Henderson. They have done some hugely wonderful things, and I'm just delighted that I was able to assist. And until my dying day, I will continue to assist in that battle. And it is a battle. So come on, gentlemen, stand up, be counted. You can do a damn sight more. So come on, let's do it. Thank you, Matt.
No, thank you. Thank you very, very much, Jim. And I think it's always interesting whenever conversations like this come up, I always look at the demographic of who want to attend various sessions that we have through the year. And unfortunately, it's no surprise that on this session today, even when we're looking now, it's still 90% female that have attended today's session. And I know that isn't the normal split of the roundtable, but it's, as you say, there is a place for voices like yours. I'd love to, voices like mine to come in and go, we can do more, we must do more. And if anything's going to change, we have as much to influence as everybody else. So I'm really grateful for you coming on today and sharing some of that insight.
This episode of the Social Housing Roundtable is sponsored by Alertical. Alertical helps as many people as possible feel safe, connected and informed by combining ingenious technology and award-winning human contact. Alertical's digital engagement solution helps social landlords proactively know their customers and properties by putting a portable touchscreen in every home, offering a daily property check through the optional OK Each Day service, plus repairs reporting, tenant surveys and much more. They also provide Beyond Warden Calls, an easier, simpler and lower cost wireless warden call solution with video door entry, dispersed telecare and smoke alarms. Alertical works with over 60 housing providers across the UK to enhance two-way engagement between customers and landlords. In 2022, Alertical won the Queen's Award for Enterprise and Innovation, and in 2023 won Housing Supplier of the Year. I'm delighted to have them as our sponsor of the Social Housing Roundtable throughout 2024.
I can see there's a question that's come through from Neil that I'm just going to ask to the panel and to anyone who'd like to dive on, which was, I can remember very live conversations on the correct categorization of DA, DV, and whether it should sit within ASB. It very much ended in a muddled approach. What is your preferred method of handling DA and DV from an organisational or case management point of view? I don't know if anyone would like to dive in on that one. Kelly?
Yeah, I can come in on that one. Yeah, from my point of view, I feel that we need to treat them as very different. And I remember first having conversations at the time. We used to, in my day job, as well as obviously co-founding Daha, I used to sell a case management tool around domestic abuse, which many people might have kind of bought back in the day. And at the time we had many people who used to use a case management tool which was ASB focused, and so we didn't, and domestic abuse was one category of ASB. So for me, the two different things, and I absolutely hate them being classed as kind of one thing. I will die on that hill. It should not be happening. But I do think that there's lots of learning and lots of tools and powers in ASB that we can apply to domestic abuse. And I've done various webinars on this with the brilliant Janine Green, where we teamed up. And if anybody who knows Janine will know she's like the be-all and end-all in ASB. So we decided to kind of team up together and to look at things from our, different points of view. So something like a closure order, for example, using a closure order in case of domestic abuse and how that could actually have a positive outcome. So I think we shouldn't throw, I hate this saying, but I always end up using it, throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I think that we could look at the tools that we've got. How do we apply those to domestic abuse? But understanding that we need very different responses to ASB and domestic abuse. And I think this leads to another conversation about, when we're talking about being a housing professional and what that means. And I'm a very proud housing professional. So I think, if you were coming into housing now, what skills and knowledge do you need? So I remember, back in 1997, starting out in housing, and the training that I got, I definitely remember having quite a bit of antisocial behaviour training. Never got any domestic abuse training and kind of, that trauma-informed training. So I think there's a lot that we need to include in discussions around professionalism for housing staff as well, that would really tease out this as well. So as I say, for me, two different responses, but learning can be taken from ASB.
I'm going to bring in Alison, and then I'm going to go to Nikki. Alison, over to you.
I think part of the issue is that we have in society, within housing, we have this really binary approach. There are good people and there are bad people. And there is an inbuilt expectation that, inverted commas, victims are pure and unsullied, and then there's a big man standing over there who is evil. And people lead really, really messy lives. I remember seeing a statistic once that said quite often for housing providers, the first time they become aware of a woman who might be experiencing abuse is when she is being reported herself as the perpetrator of a noise nuisance by a neighbour. I mean, that basically means she's screaming too loud.
Yeah.
But once within our organisations, once somebody has got the label of perpetrator, I think institutionally we find it very, very difficult to step back and say, well, actually, is there something more complex behind this? We have reporting systems that say tick box A or tick box B. So we're already done, and it's the same with rent arrears. So as soon as somebody is in significant rent arrears, they're on a little pathway that ends with one of those letters with red writing on that people put in the bin that actually says, we're going to go to court and get you out. You're already on a way of thinking, whereas we know from a report that CIH Cymru did 10 years ago that said, domestic abuse is one of the leading drivers of rent arrears. But it's standing back, using professional judgment, looking at relationships and households in the round, and stop expecting your inverted commas victims to be as pure as the driven snow. Because if I was experiencing the things that people are experiencing on a day-to-day basis, I do not think it would bring out the best in me. So why do we assume that of everybody else?
And we often say, don't we, that whenever there's anybody who's going through any form of abuse, sometimes there will be acting out, there'll be behaviours of, particularly against people close to them or whatever it will be, and it's finding what's behind the door. But we do struggle in the domestic violence space, and I couldn't agree more. And Nikki, I'm going to bring you in. I'm going to go to Jim, who I could see had a couple of, I think Jim would dive on a couple of things as well. But Nikki, I'll come to yourself first.
Well, thank you. And yeah, brilliant panel. Could listen literally to everybody talking all day. Yeah, for me, and I come from, as some people may know, I do come from working 13 years sort of frontline in housing, so very fresh, only a year out. And for me, there's quite a clear distinction between the two things, and I completely agree with everything that Kelly and Alison has said. But for me, domestic abuse is a safeguarding issue because it's about protecting somebody from abuse. ASB is a tenancy management issue. Now, they do very, very often in the front line present as the same thing. As Alison said, noise nuisance is so common. And I think to help providers to actually distinguish between the two of those things and what's going on there. And as Alison said, sometimes the perpetrator will be the victim, and that can be hard to get your head around, but there are reasons behind that. And you should always sort of take that safeguarding point of view. But in terms of sort of looking at that, you need to look at it and say, is there domestic abuse going on there? Is there something? So you get that noise nuisance complaint, and you train your staff to ask the questions. Well, okay, they were shouting and screaming all night. What gender was the voice that was shouting? What gender was the voice that was screaming? Could you hear any words? Could you hear what was being said? Did anyone sound scared? Was there anything like punches? Get that information, and that helps you then to figure out what's going on there. And if it is domestic abuse, you need to deal with that side in order, in my experience, to deal with the ASB. So.
Thank you very much, Nikki. Jim, I'm going to bring you in.
Now, just quickly on the neighbours listening to noises and complaining about the noise, I've got to say to you, when I was growing up, I used to lie in bed listening to my mother being abused by my father, and I would pray that a neighbour would complain. So if a neighbour complains, we have to take this seriously, and the questions, the right questions have to be asked, the right analysis has to be done. But for God's sake, please do not ignore that, because that's from someone who suffered it. It's real, it's live, and it's still happening. So listen to what a neighbour says to you. Or take the complaint very seriously. Ask the right questions, and it all comes down to training. We have to train our people to make sure they ask the right questions and they approach this correctly. So take it from me, there'll be a kid lying there wishing that a neighbour would do something. They never did it in my case.
Thank you, Jim. Alex, I saw you had your hand up. Do you want to come in? Unless he's lowered it.
No, it's okay. No, thank you.
Get you back. Oh, you're okay. Okay, no worries at all. So there was a question that came through from Neil, which was, is there a consistent approach to disregarding the local connection test with local authority collection allocations policies? Kelly, I don't know if you've got any insight on that one at all.
Yeah, well, obviously we know that shouldn't be happening, but what we find is when survivors are approaching the local authority, they're not always getting the response that they need. And a lot of my work is doing training to local authority housing options homeless teams, and quite often I'll mention about the homeless code of guidance around domestic abuse, and quite often many people will say, oh, what's that? I've not seen that. So I think there's a big piece of work to be done there to make sure that all housing options homeless teams are trained in what domestic abuse might look like, how somebody might present. Did a piece of work with Durham University looking at the Respect Male Victims Helpline as well. And that research found that quite often men found that they would not get a good response if they kind of went to present as homeless, and the kind of some of that stigma around kind of, well, I should be able to deal with this, I should be able to cope with this. So I think there's a lot of work to be done about who's presenting as homeless in local authorities, and what do staff, what training have staff had to understand that. And I don't know if anyone remembers, it's probably maybe about 7 or 8 years ago, but when something just sticks in your head, and if you saw, I think it was a Channel 4 programme on dispatches, and it showed you women presenting as homeless at local authorities, and some of the way that kind of that gatekeeping happened, where they were prevented from making a valid homeless kind of application. So I think there's a lot of training, a lot of understanding to be done. And I remember my first job back in the day in Sunderland in 1992 was to accompany women in the refuge where my placement was to present as homeless, and in some ways I think some of the things that the women encountered there, that stigma and the way they were treated, I still hear about happening today. And I just think what a disgrace that is. So I think for me, making sure that housing options and homeless teams understand legislation and what's expected of them, for me, is still a massive gap. I
couldn't agree more, unfortunately. There was a point in the chat there from Jess, which says, this is a fantastic topic. Thank you all. I'm from Saint-Gobain Offsite Solutions, so a supplier to the sector, and have recently been involved in talks around social value on new developments. I think it's key to address this within domestic abuse and domestic violence. As Stephanie says, with research, there are strong links with social issues, financial and DVDA. Surely social value can play a positive part to support. Lade, I'm going to bring you in and then I'm going to go back to Alison. Lade, over to you.
Yeah, so I speak from perspective of a housing options team manager in a local authority. I'm kind of going to the question you asked earlier about when victims approach local authority, would the question of local connection arise? It should not arise. We have the Domestic Abuse Act that actually does say they should be given like for like. I know as well that we have the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance accreditation, which is being done not just with housing association, but also with local authorities. And what that accreditation does, one of the things I say about it is that it's a fantastic accreditation. It's not punitive. The organization will sit down with you and make sure that your processes align with the requirement of the Act. So they're looking at your allocation policy, they're looking at your triaging system, they're looking at quite a lot of things. No local authority should be asking any question around local connection, whether for part 6 or part 7. So, well, I totally understand that not everyone is aware yet, but it's one of the things that DAHA is doing, and they're doing a brilliant work at the moment in making sure they raise awareness at the local authority end, not just with housing associations.
Thank you very much. Alison, I'll bring you back in.
I think one of the things that sort of dawned on me gradually was the not just the fact that housing is where most domestic abuse takes place and that it can be a solution, but also it can be a cause. And I think the housing shortage has contributed to living arrangements. I mean, this is just because I'm old, right? But you know, meeting someone and then moving in with them 3 months later, and you'll both save a bit on the rent if you only have one rent to pay. And then suddenly it all goes a bit tits up and you don't know, sorry. The relationship needs to finish at that point, but housing keeps you together. And I think quite often that is a real driver because there are not enough places for people to live. I mean, I'm old enough to think we ought to go back to courting. Anyone remember that word? Just me and Jim, I think possibly. But also the lack of appropriate housing, on a national scale, drives behaviours within. I mean, I can't imagine the stress of working in a London local authority, homelessness department when you have no accommodation and temporary accommodation is full and your local authority is going broke. So we begin to see rationing take place because that's just what happens. So I'm beginning to see over the last three years sort of more anecdotes of people, housing professionals saying, and this is dreadful, obviously, oh, I think there's so many people reporting domestic abuse, I think they're only saying it in order to get housing. And it's one of those issues that we've really, really got to face head on. And I don't think we've had that conversation within the sector yet. So what is driving a housing profession? No one goes into housing to make that kind of stigmatized judgment. And I think it's a symptom of an absolutely broken system. But the fact that people who are working in housing are saying that women are going, it's humiliating to report abuse to, a faceless bureaucrat is not something that anybody does for a bit of a laugh. Okay, it can be traumatizing. You've been asked to replay your trauma time after time after time, reporting the same thing to different people. And then if our judgment is, oh, well, you're only saying that in order to get a transfer, or you're only saying that in order, can you prove it? It feels like we are going back 30, 40 years to the late 70s, early 80s, when you literally, as I said earlier, had to have a black eye. We've seen situations where local authorities ask for a letter. I mean, this is so Kafkaesque. Want a letter from the perpetrator where he will agree that that's what he's done. I mean, It's heartbreaking, but it's unprofessional, and that's why we need the training and the sort of the backbone from the organisation to say, actually, these are our values, this is what we stand for, and we're not going to, that is not the way we're going to do business.
I agree, and there's a point actually made by Keith Bowman in the chat, which says very useful, like sessions like this are to revitalise our approach to domestic abuse, that there's a degree of preaching to the converted. What are the messages we can use to engage those who would not attend discussions like this, or who would take part in initiatives like the 16 days? How do we show the impact across society and all our lives beyond the individual? And it ties very much into that point you're making there around, after a while, we hear, I think some people who work in housing, particularly in customer services in the front line, those kind of roles, are hearing so much stuff day after day after day, they kind of become neutralized to it and forget about the individual. But Kelly, I'm going to bring you in.
Yeah, I wasn't going to respond to that, but on that, never want to miss an opportunity. I think on that as well, I think that brings us back to the discussion about professionalism. So as a proud housing professional, we need to incorporate those things into what we expect our housing professionals to do. And, from induction to training, making sure that people are trained. And I've noticed a couple of things on the chat have talked about that. So I think that is something. I just wanted to quickly highlight some work that I've been doing with the Drive partnership, and I know we've got Viv but Viv, I think you're from Drive, aren't you? Officially from Drive, not just Respect. So we were commissioned by Drive to look at kind of creating a housing pathway for perpetrators of domestic abuse. And I remember back in my Sunderland days, where I set up a perpetrator programme with a housing element with 3 different charities. And you can imagine the joy of everybody when I said, oh, well, look, we want to be housing perpetrators. You can imagine how popular I was. But for me, it was about kind of keeping the survivors in their own home when it was kind of safe to do that. So, and I think that's a discussion that we need to be having. What are we doing? And I think leading on from what Alison was saying, what are we doing about kind of doing all that we can to make sure that we've got a suite of options. So in some cases, it might be great if we can remove the perpetrator and house them elsewhere, so the victim survivor can stay in their home where the kids go to the school around the corner, the mum lives in the next street, they've got that support network, they've got one bus to get to work. Instead of kind of having to move into a refuge, then maybe you get given an introductory tenancy when, before you're on a secure tenancy, which shouldn't be happening, but we know it does. So I think that we need to be looking at the cause of the problem, perpetrators, and we need to be looking at what we can do about that. So it's been a really interesting piece of work. And then looking at kind of how legislation, I suppose, and expectations and policies keep us going down this same route, but what do we need to do differently? And let's have that discussion as housing professionals. What do we need to do differently around kind of looking at all options for victim survivors? And that includes the unpalatable thing of thinking, well, yeah, we want to give a perpetrator of domestic abuse a home. But if we look at it from that different point of view, we want to allow that victim survivor to stay in their own home and have that different onus. I think that's something that we need to look at. So that's a really interesting piece of work that we've been doing at addressing domestic abuse with Professor Sarah Weidel and Dr. Nicole Renahan as well. So I just thought I'd add that in to our discussions, because it's not like we've got enough to do, but I think we're missing a part of the conversation if we don't look at this as an issue.
To those that missed, and thank you very much, Kelly, I'm going to try and do a quick whistle-stop tour of the chat before we kind of go to final thoughts. But to those that couldn't quite hear Stephanie's points earlier, so CIH have done some work with Scottish landlords. Of the 73 Scottish landlords who signed the pledge, CIH were only able to access 41 of their domestic abuse policies, and of those, less than a quarter met the requirements of the 2019 Good Practice Guidance. And then there's almost all of Make a Stand signees mentioned domestic abuse in their allocations policy, but this is certainly only above the original rate. Less than a fifth signees explicitly made an exemption for housing-related debt in the case of domestic abuse. So some of those points are absolutely huge, and exactly why I wanted CIH to come on and help run today. There's a bit in the chat around kind of partial closures, which I'll come on to in a moment, but as Kelly mentioned, they've been working with Drive Partnerships, so thank you very much for kind of highlighting that. As Keith said, we can't separate ASB and DA completely, since it's very, very often the ASB that leads us to the domestic abuse. And Sharon mentioned this is where triaging is absolutely necessary for all reports of ASB by trained officers in ASB, safeguarding, domestic abuse, hate crime, ACE, trauma, getting it right first time. Unfortunately, many organisations do not approach for the right first time, and labels are given incorrectly and generated, which was to Alison's point earlier as well. Marie's mentioned it's important to know that domestic violence can be financial abuse, not just violence. We haven't even talked about the breadth of domestic abuse in today's session. Unfortunately, we haven't had time. But Neil said he wants to live next door to domestic abuse and domestic violence. It was that loud. The lady on the other side pulled my partner aside asking if I was hurting her. Wife had called the police who attended. In the end, the couple moved out, sadly, together. But not sure if others reported it, but it was that loud you couldn't mistake what was going on, yet still nothing was being done. Sharon asked what was the programme, Kelly, and Kelly said Dispatches 2017 if you did miss it. CB has said that this involves children too. That's how I was removed, under a child protection order. Neighbours complaining about me screaming. Alex has said, when does cyclical nature of domestic violence become ASB for neighbours hearing and reporting it? Sharon had mentioned, I think it's ASB for the neighbours, but it's domestic abuse for the survivors. And Jim, Alicia said that as a tenant, I reported noise arising from domestic violence, which didn't make me very popular with the tenant involved or with the partner who was caught in the cycle of abuse and wouldn't leave. It did it for the little girl caught in the middle, and everything going on there, I'm sure you've all got experience of. Sarah said, in terms of allocations, we've noticed a higher number of domestic abuse survivors coming top of waiting lists, but it could be that 4 of the 5 allocations for a scheme are domestic abuse survivors. Our comments are we making others vulnerable if we're housing survivors next to each other, or does it make for stronger communities as customers may support each other? And that's a really interesting point, maybe for a future roundtable there, Sarah, so thank you for raising it. And as you can see, the chat is going on, and we're slowly running out of time. I was thinking if there's any kind of questions that have come through. Neil, is there a piece here on the legal side? More than happy to house more perpetrators at His Majesty's pleasure. Does the issue with courts and justice system impact here? And Sharon, we need to give those with lived experience a platform to share their suggestions. What was their experience like? Did they have a choice? Were they listened to? As housing providers, we need to hear more from those who come to work to make a difference. Huge amounts of points being raised there. I'm going to go to Alison, to Stephanie, and to Kelly for kind of final thoughts on those 3 points. This clearly isn't a one-off session. We could have run this for 2 hours quite comfortably today. But Alison, just in terms of final thoughts on some of those points being raised there, and sorry if I missed people's points in the chats out, I'm just wary of time. What are your thoughts in terms of whether we have really truly made that difference from the time you yourself was CIH president to now, and also what do we hope to see change, I guess, from Unite's 16 Days of Activism this year?
So I think housing undoubtedly has started to take domestic abuse more seriously than it used to, for a whole host of reasons, and that's all to the good. Housing does like fads, though. It has hobbies, and then it moves on to the next shiny unicorn. And I would ask everyone who's on this call to continue to make demands of their senior management to take this absolutely seriously. Can I end with an anecdote very quickly? So my son's a leaseholder, housing association flat. He rang me up one day and said, I think the woman next door is beating her children. What should I do? And I got on the website of their landlord and said, look, they've got a really good safeguarding page. This is the person. You can email, you can phone, whatever. Give them a ring. And he said, I'm not going to do that because they can't fix the damp. And if they can't fix the damp, I can't trust them with a child's life. Now, it's all linked together, and it's about trust. And if the people who live in the homes that we own don't trust us to do the very basics, then why should we trust them to make disclosures of a deeply, deeply personal nature to us? So it's about upping all our game. But my final point would be, we did ask people to commit to make a stand, and we really need to start to look really seriously, as Steph says, the progress that is made. And so if you do one thing, again, if you go back to your organisation and say, please send your policy and please start thinking about impact. Because if nothing's changed as a result of this, except that you've got a nice policy, then it's not helping a single woman or child. Thank you.
Agree more. Kelly, to yourself, and then I'm going to end with Stephanie.
Yeah, I won't take up much time. I just want to shout out for everybody who's doing everything they can and to keep putting the pressure on, to keep asking the questions, to be keep being that awkward person asking the questions and trying to make a difference. There's people obviously on the call today, you know, Alex at CIH, obviously Stephanie, kind of asking the questions, keep, you know, pushing these things. We've got Nikki doing some great work, and my old colleague Sharon there, I can see Sharon Crosby, continuing, you know, to be asking the questions and fighting and making sure that this stays on everybody's agenda. What are your board doing? What do your board know? But, you know, I'm a board member, and I want to make sure that I want to know what we're doing as an organisation. So,
No, thank you, Kelly. And Stephanie, final thoughts.
Thoughts. Just to go back to the local authority who said that they saw those rising numbers of people presenting with DA for their reason for presenting as homeless. It's the second most prevalent reason that's reported for households coming forward, and that may not, and that's the primary reason. There are plenty of people who come to homelessness who we won't know that that's the reason that they are homeless. But when the Renters' Rights Bill goes forward, and that's banning Section 21 evictions, and that is strengthening renters' rights in the private rental sector, what we'll find is that the proportion of those homeless households who are domestic abuse will be much higher. So any approach to tackling homelessness in this country will not work unless we tackle the domestic abuse at the same time. And I would love to invite anyone who's on the call who works for either a local authority or a registered provider to email afterwards within their team, whoever is leading on domestic abuse, to get in contact to either commit or recommit to the Make a Stand pledge, which CIH is reinvigorating as part of our 16 Days of Activism, and help us just find out what's going on and what the national picture is and what those steps are that Kelly outlined that we can do to improve those outcomes for women and children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. I think the important part there is committing to the pledge and doing something about it. And it's those two pieces in conjunction. And as Michelle's put in the chat, we must ensure organisations roll out awareness on domestic violence training to frontline trades teams as well. As they go into the homes, they're often male and they're the eyes and the ears, and sometimes their insight is also invaluable. As I say, we could have run this for so much time today. I really, really thank all of our panel. Thank you so much for coming on. Thank you to the Chartered Institute of Housing for sponsoring 4 sessions of the Social Housing Roundtable this year. It's been fantastic working with them, and today has been absolutely no exception. A thank you to Alertical for sponsoring this year's series of the Social Housing Roundtable. But for now, to all of you, I hope there's something you were able to take away from today. I've certainly had many, many things I've taken away. I will do a wrap-up of this later in the week. And I hope if you are new to the Roundtable, you can join us in future sessions. But for now, thank you very much, and we'll wrap up there. Cheers all.